But as for now, you are very welcome to the Cemus Research Forum. We're very happy to see you here. In the Cemus Research Forum, we are a platform for doctoral students that focuses on sustainable development. And our members are PhD students from across the Uppsala University, but we also welcome students from across Sweden, if that would be the case. So you're welcome to join us here on this open session. And we're happy to have Riccardo Mastini here from the Autonomous University of Barcelona. We're very happy to have you here, Riccardo. I will hand over to you.
Thank you, Elena, and good morning, everyone. I'm very glad to be with you today. And my name is Riccardo Mastini, and I'm a PhD researcher in ecological economics and political ecology at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. The focus of my research is on the intersections between the political discourse of the Green New Deal and the theory of degrowth, so post-growth economics. I'm also an advisor to the international campaign Green New Deal for Europe, which was launched by DM25 in 2019, and it's striving to bring together a coalition of grassroots movements, think tanks, researchers to try and hammer out a progressive Green New Deal agenda for the European Union. And so the research, let's say the intersections, the points of tensions, but also the points of convergence between the Green New Deal discourse and post-growth economics is precisely what I like to talk about today. I will structure my talk in two main parts. First, I will discuss the genesis and the evolution of the concept of the Green New Deal, and then also sketching out what are the main features of the latest incarnation of the Green New Deal, the one that I believe should be considered most relevant for our debate. And then in the second part, I will discuss why I think that it should be grounded in post-growth economics in order to deliver on its objectives of social equality and ecological sustainability. So without any further ado, I'd like to start discussing the details of the political discourse that has come to be known as the Green New Deal, which a term, Green New Deal, that was first used in the late 90s in some policy briefings, academic research, but without receiving much attention. The first time that the Green New Deal term gained prominence was in 2008, when Thomas Friedman, famous New York Times columnist, used this term as an invitation, let's say, to the two presidential candidates at the time, meaning McCain and Obama, to embrace this term as an umbrella term for an ambitious sustainability strategy that would be able to relaunch the American economy. So you have to be reminded, it was 2008, just in the aftermath of the financial crisis. And so Obama actually heeded, let's say, the invitation of Thomas Friedman, and he started using the term Green New Deal on the campaign trail. And once he was sworn into office, his administration approved a stimulus package of which, let's say, a sizable share was oriented towards energy efficiency and renewable energy. As time went on, with the financial crisis becoming a global economic recession, numerous governments and international institutions adopted the idea of adding energy efficiency and renewable energy investments to their counter-cyclical fiscal stimulus packages. At the time, the United Nations Environmental Programme, let's say, jumped on the Green New Deal bandwagon and issued a policy brief titled Global Green New Deal. This was March 2009, to coordinate various national economic stimulus plans. The report, the UNEP report, recommended an expenditure of at least 1% of GDP on green initiatives. But actually only few countries met these investment targets, notably South Korea and China. whereas the US fell short of this objective, since it invested only 0.9% of its fiscal package on, let's say, on green initiatives, whereas the European Union spent only 0.2% of its recovery package on green initiatives. So as you can see, and overall the G20 countries didn't achieve this target. So it was, let's say, quite a failure. As time went on in 2010, the global economic consensus turned from stimulus to austerity. At the G20 meeting in Toronto in June 2010, global leaders, let's say, marked a point of departure away from Keynesian economics, which had up to that point informed state responses to the global financial crisis. And under the banner of growth-friendly fiscal consolidation, balanced budget, deficit hysteria, let's say, became the dogma of G20 governments, and any talk of a Green New Deal withered on the vine. So this is what I would categorize as the first, let's say, brief interlude of the Green New Deal gaining any political traction. So a short window of time between 2010 and 2010. However, while, let's say, the first incarnation of the Green New Deal, this first incarnation was merely an economic stimulus for revamping the growth machine, the latest incarnation of the Green New Deal discourse that has been emerging since 2018 is radically different from the previous one. So the reason why actually I recounted the history, let's say, of the first phase of the Green New Deal is for you to better appreciate the progressive radicalization and increasing openness of the Green New Deal discourse to, let's say, anti-capitalist ideas. So what I'm going to discuss here is the latest and most radical version of the Green New Deal, which was articulated by a broad coalition of, let's say, eco-socialist grassroots movements, primarily in the US, but more and more also in the EU. So there are many different understandings of what the Green New Deal stands for nowadays. And let's say everybody is trying to grab this term and stretch it in order to serve their agenda. So in a way, if we want to discuss about the Green New Deal, we have to kind of make a choice. You know, which ones of these many streams are we gonna follow? And the one I want to discuss here with you today is, let's say, its most radical version, the one that I think it's really what the climate justice movement is trying to push forward. So let's say that this new version of the Green New Deal bears a close resemblance to Roosevelt's New Deal, from which, of course, the term. So FDR's New Deal was a series of social programs, public work projects, financial reforms, and also labor regulations, which were enacted in the aftermath of the Great Depression in the 30s. So key features of the New Deal, such as public ownership of strategic utilities, social and labor reforms, and also a job guarantee, have come to characterize the latest and most radical Green New Deal articulation since 2018. Let's say that at its core, this Green New Deal narrative prescribes the need for an active role of the state in the economy. And in doing so, Green New Deal proponents intend to heed Keynes' famous advice, and I quote, "The important thing for government is not to do things which individuals are doing already and do them a little better or a little worse, but rather to do those things which at present are not done at all," end quote. So this means fully deploying the power of public investment and coordination in a historic break from the neoliberal dogma of the past 30, 40 years. So in a nutshell, we could say that Green New Deal advocates take the view that the ecological crisis is part of a wider social crisis caused by unbridled capitalism, and they aim to solve it not through market mechanisms, but rather by redistributing economic and political power. if we accepted this thesis that the ecological crisis is a colossal failure of the free market, well, the first step is to recognize the need for public interventions that go beyond the simple modification of prices, such as, for example, a carbon tax or subsidies for green technologies, and instead adopt public interventions that impose strict limits on emissions and adopt rigid environmental standards in line with scientific evidence. So in summary, we can say that the ecological transition cannot depend on a microeconomic approach when what we need is a new political economy. Consistent, in my opinion, with these premises, the Green New Deal discourse refuses to reduce the ecological transition to a question of individual lifestyles, which runs the risk of courting, let's say, elitism, and therefore potentially alienating a vast majority of citizens. Rather, the Green New Deal presents the ecological transition as a fundamentally collective issue and therefore political. In essence, we can say that the Green New Deal framework operates by constantly delivering and broadcasting tangible quality of life improvements for the majority of citizens, while transforming the way we produce, consume, and live. Now, this was a broad brush, let's say, description of some of its main tenets, and now I would like to delve into some of its constitutive features and analyze them one by one, and also see how they interact among them. So the first one that I would like to discuss is the focus on environmental inequality within society. So to better understand this, we first have to look at the correlation between economic and environmental inequality. So research has by far demonstrated, I think, quite convincingly that income is by far the most important determinant of environmental impact for an individual or a household. So it doesn't matter how green you think you are, if you have surplus money, you end up spending it. The only form of consumption that's clearly and positively correlated with good environmental intentions is diet. So people who see themselves as green tend to eat less meat and more organic vegetables. But these kind of green attitudes have little bearing on the amount of, for instance, transport fuels, home energy, and other materials that the citizen consumes. And in fact, energy footprints grow with expenditures, and as a consequence are unequally distributed in society. Among all the countries for which, let's say, studies have been conducted so far, the top 10% of citizens by wealth consume roughly 20 times more energy than the bottom 10% of society. Additionally, as income increases, people spend more of their money on energy-intensive goods, such as packaged holidays or cars, leading to high energy inequality. Indeed, the researchers found that 187 times more vehicle fuel energy is used by the top 10% consumers relatively to the bottom 10%, 187 times. That's quite an order of magnitude. So increases in inequality of wealth and income are consistently linked with higher emissions. So the more a society is unequal, the higher the average carbon footprint per person is. This is because the affluent have the most to gain from climate disrupting activities, while at the same time being able to shield themselves from the worst impacts of climate disruption. This is what is usually referred to as the double injustice. So you consume more, but you are less likely to be impacted by this disproportionate consumption. So on top of all this, there is the long-standing observation that the opulent lifestyles of the wealthier classes influence the less wealthy, driving wasteful production and consumption at all income levels. This is the so-called Veblen Effect, which refers to the purchase of goods and services that perform the function of exhibiting and making evident differences in status. And the luxury consumption of the wealthier classes influences the consumption of the poorer social groups, since they generate social envy. Let's say an unequal society is also an anxious society, one that is all too readily given to positional consumption that adds little to overall happiness, but contributes significantly to unsustainable resource throughput. So these observations are also further corroborated by a recent study that estimated the relationship between human well-being and carbon emissions. So the more inequalities increases in a society, in a country, the greater the amount of emissions are needed to improve collective well-being, since these emissions are often channeled in private consumption rather than in public goods. And this is a topic I will return to later. Therefore, reducing inequality in a society would allow both to mitigate the climate crisis and increase the quality of life of citizens. So this is why this, let's say, theme, this aspect of environmental justice is so much at the core of the Green New Deal discourse. Also because, and the emphasis is often placed on frontline and vulnerable communities in the Green New Deal discourse. And they are seen as one of the constituencies that might be, let's say, the most crucial social actors to build this winning coalition around a Green New Deal. And this is because there is a direct relationship between wealth and carbon emissions, as I've just discussed, while there is an inverse relationship between personal wealth and environmental and vulnerability to environmental disasters. So this means that the ones most heavily affected by the climate crisis are the ones who contributed the least to causing it, while being the least able to afford mitigation and adaptation measures. So it follows from all these considerations that the Green New Deal postulates the fact that it should be the wealthy, should be the ones that have been the most responsible for the ecological crisis to foot the bill for financing a Green New Deal, while the most vulnerable should receive help by, for example, expanding the welfare state in order to navigate, let's say, an age of profound economic transformation and more frequent environmental disasters. So in light of all these considerations, you I think start seeing why environmental justice is so central to the Green New Deal political discourse. And this importance is also reverberated, so to speak, on the proposal, let's say on the policies proposals that are put forward in most Green New Deal policy packages. Let's see now why, for example, carbon taxation is often neglected, or let's say not at the center of most Green New Deal proposals, and is somehow considered marginal to the discourse, whereas wealth taxation features prominently. So in a nutshell, we could say that a carbon tax delegates to the law of supply and demand the shift in consumption habits. So the economic logic of the carbon tax stems from the idea that we are all equally responsible in a way for the climate crisis, and that therefore we must all internalize the negative externalities that our consumption habits entail, regardless of whether this, let's say, carbon consumption is to satisfy essential needs or luxury ones. This macroeconomic approach of the carbon tax focuses on the carbon molecule, we might say, and that has a regressive and therefore counterproductive effects on the articulation of a progressive environmental discourse. The nexus between economic and environmental inequality that I previously discussed constitutes a significant barrier to instigating environmental change through the price mechanism. So the fact is that a carbon-centric approach, so to speak, can disproportionately impact lower income families who spend a larger share of their incomes on fuel. Therefore, this lever of carbon taxation is less effective in unequal countries, as the relatively affluent tend to be immune from the price rises designed to engender more sustainable consumption patterns. I think that what we witnessed in France with the Gilets jaunes protest about 1 year ago is a cautionary tale with respect to all these considerations, let's say, on the regressive effects of carbon taxations. Therefore, in the light of all these considerations, the Green New Deal proponents argue that if we want to carbon taxation in a fair and effective way, first, we need to tax wealth and drastically reduce inequality, since, as I was saying, this kind of policy works better in a more equal society. And so the sequencing of the policies to be adopted is quite crucial. Before taxing carbon, we must offer people alternative ways of meeting their needs. For example, taxing wealth should be a means to expand fare-free and carbon-free public services, and only then, for example, adopting a tax on gasoline and fossil fuels in general can actually be socially acceptable and yield the results that were intended. So this doesn't mean that the carbon tax has no role to play in a Green New Deal, but rather that it should be applied with attention to its redistributive effects. For instance, different habits require different forms of action. While energy-intensive consumption, such as flying and driving SUVs or sport cars, which mostly, of course, occurs at high, let's say, incomes, could indeed be regulated through energy taxes. That could be, let's say, a socially desirable way of going about it. But the energy footprint arising, for example, from heating your house or the electricity that you need to keep the lights on should be reduced rather than by a carbon taxation, rather by massive scaling up of public investment programs in housing retrofit, so that we don't leave it to individual tenants to shoulder the cost of insulating their houses. On top of all these considerations on environmental inequality and environmental justice within societies, the Green New Deal takes also a broader look at the issue of environmental justice, confronting, again, the most radical articulation of the Green New Deal, not all of them, confronting, I think in quite a bold way, the issue of ecological debt. So we know from climate models developed by the IPCC that the world needs to reach net zero emissions by 2050 at the latest. But of course, this target should be modulated according to the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, which is really at the heart of climate diplomacy. So countries that have historically emitted the most must carbonize their economies faster to leave a larger portion of the remaining carbon budget to countries in the global south. And that's why Green New Deal advocates argued that wealthy countries must reach net zero by 2030. That's the target that is put forward by grassroots climate justice movement. And we will see, of course, in the latter part of the talk, why then post-growth economics is so essential to achieving such an ambitious objective. And also its articulation, let's say, with global supply chains for minerals and materials in general that are needed to develop clean energy technologies. Another aspect that then is connected with this one of global, let's say, environmental justice is the one of wealth transfer. So climate compensations for the ecological debt that exists between the global north and the global south, and also there are strong proposals for a technology transfer. So let's say patent-free transfer of renewable energy, energy efficiency technologies to global South countries. Because of course we know that patents are one of the biggest hindrances to the green transition in global South countries. And I think that this debate around patents is particularly relevant nowadays, given the issue of potentially developing a patented vaccine for COVID, and how much this has become a thorny issue again on the global stage, and how many civil society groups now are trying to put pressure to bear on their governments for ensuring that this vaccine is patent-free and available to all. After having discussed the issue of environmental justice at the national level and at the international level, I'd like to turn to the labor dimension of the Green New Deal. So the Green New Deal aims to overcome the historic disagreement between the protection of work and the protection of the environment. This is why the so-called just transition framework is one of the cornerstones of the Green New Deal discourse. So the proposed strategy is somehow to promise, so to speak, benefits from the ecological conversion, ecological transition, to a sufficient number of workers, so as to bring together a winning political coalitions. And this is particularly targeted to gaining consensus in the industrialized areas where far-right parties are getting the most votes. For instance, production and installation of renewable energy plants, just like the retrofitting of the buildings, the repairing of objects and appliances, and small-scale agroecology are all activities that can create many jobs, which are difficult to delocalize to other countries, and that are difficult, if not impossible, to automate. So these three elements make it a particularly, let's say, appealing green industrial strategy that can promise a certain degree of reindustrialization in countries that over the past few decades have seen all their manufacturing being offshored abroad. But in addition of creating green jobs in the private sector, one of the flagship proposals of the Green New Deal is the job guarantee. Which is a permanent, nationally funded program that supplies employment opportunities on demand for all those who are ready and willing to work at a decent living wage, focusing on community needs that are not met by public services. So the job guarantee, in a nutshell, gives public authorities the duty to fund the employment of anybody who wants a job but cannot find one in the private labor market. This is, bear in mind, different from work fairs, which requires the recipients of benefits to accept any job that is offered to them, not to lose their aid. On the contrary, the job guarantee jobs that are provided through these programs are optional. So people who cannot or do not want to work will still be able to apply for traditional benefits. Now, the job guarantee is the policy that has been, let's say, it's been around for a while, developed by Minsky in the 30s. And now the idea is to try and add somehow a green twist to it. So the idea is that work provided through the job guarantee should be channeled toward any activity deemed socially and environmental desirables, since it should be focused on production for use rather than production for exchange. So the idea is somehow that a green job guarantee should shift the income and welfare creation from industrial production and towards social and environmental reproduction. So this means an increased role of work focused on the maintenance, repair of the natural environment, just like an increased role of work focused on care activities, so to speak, for social reproduction, such as education, medical support to an aging population, community services. So this is part of a strategy to try and shift away work from production and towards socio-ecological reproduction. I think this is a key point which intersects quite well with let's say, post-growth economics that we'll be discussing later. Now, another key feature of the Green New Deal discourse is public ownership. So the idea is that the electrification of the energy system and its decarbonization can be facilitated by bringing strategic sectors for the green transition under public ownership. This proposal derives from the fact that investments in renewables will bring returns in much longer time frames than private companies expect, while cooperatives and municipalized companies operate with lower profit requirements. And this is why, according to data from the International Energy Agency, 70% of investments in renewable energy sectors worldwide still come from the public. Just the other day, I was reading an article saying that Norwegian pension fund was trying to find, let's say, green opportunities to invest, let's say, its money. But it was difficult to find some green projects that could assure the same rate of returns as conventional investments, because usually the rate of returns are lower and deferred on a much longer time frame. And the manager of this wealth fund that was being interviewed was saying that, of course, any investment that they would embark upon needs to meet certain standards, and for them, that's why it was so difficult to find some green investments could qualify for that. So now you understand the need for the so-called patient capital, as Mazzucato articulates it, that is essential in order to invest on these long-term and potentially risky infrastructural projects that historically have been let's say, conducted by public actors, by the public sectors. In fact, clean energy and, let's say, the low carbon infrastructure necessary to provide it is a public good. And historically, governments have directly provided these public goods, such as healthcare, roads, building the sewage systems, you name it. So in all these cases, governments do not incentivize private firms to build them, but rather they either build them themselves or contract with private firms to build them. But in either case, it is the government that coordinates constructions and operations and finances all this directly from the public purse. So treating the climate crisis as a public infrastructure challenge rather than a private, let's say, than a private market failure brings a whole range of advantages that pricing and regulation cannot provide. So, as I was saying, it enables these long time horizons that private investors are unlikely to tolerate, and it enables planning and coordination across sectors of the economy to integrate infrastructure and institutions. And besides, they enable, of course, low-cost finance that could make the price of the energy transition far more manageable. And of course, such considerations should extend in the eyes of Green New Deal advocates also to other strategic sectors for the ecological transition. So not just energy, but also water, railway, waste recycling, the housing sector, broadband in order to facilitate, let's say, telework, remote schooling in order to hamper, let's say, the rural-urban exodus, actually trying to reverse it. So the Green New Deal argument has recently been corroborated by a landmark report by the Transnational Institute, and I suggest you all to check it out, a report in which the authors trace 1,400 cases all over the world where private services have been remunicipalized and brought back under local government controls. As the authors of the report document, democratic public ownership is often more efficient, transparent, and sustainable, and therefore much better suited to coordinate and bring about a Green New Deal. Tightly linked to this aspect of public ownership of, let's say, industrial policies is the objective of decommodifying public services. So the Green New Deal narrative argues that climate change is a class struggle because it centers on the material conditions that working class people face in their daily lives. So it is about the way we move, eat, power, and heat our homes. So the Green New Deal rightly centers on sectors like housing, energy, food, and transport, and claims that we can both decarbonize them and decommodify these sectors to create better lives for the vast majority of people. And of course, in order to decarbonize the way we move, what we eat, how we supply energy and heating to our homes, we should remove these basic services from the market logic and subject them to the logic of the commons. One important reason why decommodification and decarbonization should proceed in lockstep is because the consumption of public services has a lower environmental impact than their private equivalents. And on top of that, reducing dependence on individual consumer goods mitigates competition for social status, as we were discussing before about the Veblen effect, and consequently does a lot to counteract the consumerism. And this is another point, I think, of very clear intersection with the growth discourse that we will see in a bit. So the idea is somehow that by providing these public services free of charge at the point of service, we are somehow providing, so this proposal often goes under the name of universal basic services, and we could understand this as some sort of universal basic income in kind, in which basically are provided a social wage rather than be provided, let's say, an extra wage in the national currency. Actually, part of your expenses are decommodified. So you receive this, let's say, implicit social wage. And this is much better also from an ecological perspective, because it allows the state to meet, let's say, needs of the population directly without needing to pass, let's say, through the money nexus, in which money is handed out to citizens, then in terms we spend it often by purchasing private goods and services to meet their needs, such as transportation. You're given money and then you buy a car to meet your need for transportation. What about decommodifying public transportation so that you implicitly receive a social wage, you don't have to buy transportation anymore, and we have collectively found a more sustainable way of meeting this need that every citizen has. The last point I wanted to discuss of the Green New Deal discourse is workplace democracy, which is, of course, tightly interlinked with all the others above. So the Green New Deal discourse argues that we cannot content ourselves with a more direct role of the state in the economy, but we must also democratize the workplace to win social power over material production. This is because we know that it's not so much demand that influences supply, but rather the concentration of the means of production that determines demand. Few large multinational companies and financial groups control the direction of the economy. They choose the activities in which to invest and those to be abandoned, the regions in which to place factories and those to be deindustrialized, the technologies to be used, contract and wages to be offered, the prices for consumers, and also the environmental impacts from production that are considered acceptable. So democratizing economic production means basically, first of all, involving in industrial decision-making all those who must live with the consequences of production choices, meaning local communities and workers. After all, most emissions, and this is a key aspect of the Green New Deal discourse, can be traced back to production for profit, whether it's the fossil fuel industry that still legally digs up fossil fuels and sell them for profit, or let's say the wider set of capitalists that burns those fossil fuels, such as investors-owned electric utilities, chemicals, cement, steel makers. So the emissions attached to our consumption are provisioned by for-profit producers who, let's say, wield far more power over these supply chains than we consumers do. So put it in simple terms, this class struggle at the core of the Green New Deal means forcing these producers to stop what they're doing and subjecting the production of energy and industrial production to more democratic and public criteria in the face of the planetary emergency. So this was the first part of the presentation about the Green New Deal. I realized I went way over time and I apologize for that. And I would like still, though, if we have time, to say a few words on why I think it should be grounded in post-growth economics. So Elena, please stop me if I'm going over time too much, let's say.
You are not going over time, Riccardo.
Okay, that's good. Okay. So these are the main tenets of the radical Green New Deal discourse. There are more and more openings, let's say, in the Green New Deal coalition around the need of questioning, of course, the idea of ever-increasing expansion of private material consumption, and therefore the need for questioning economic growth as an objective. I'm not saying that it is, let's say, anti-growth or, let's say, growth skeptic positions are dominant in the Green New Deal discourse, but I think that there are more and more people in that camp that is open to have this kind of conversation. So part of the research that I've been doing as part of my PhD and part of the policy work I've been doing for the Green New Deal for Europe campaign is to try and bring post-growth economics into this Green New Deal discourse. And well, the reason why I think that this is essential in order to achieve these very ambitious social and environmental goals, remember decarbonization by 2030, redistributing political and economic power, I think it requires also a deeper transformation of our economic system. And I believe I'm not the only one to think that, since over the past few years, the scientists have been increasingly warning that we may fail to reach our climate goals, even with the most, let's say, aggressive efforts, because global economic growth is driving energy demand up at a pace that's outstripping our ability to install clean power. So, for instance, today the world is producing 8 billion more megawatt hours of clean energy each year than in the year 2000. 8 billion more megawatt hours per year. That's a lot. I mean, it's actually enough to power the whole of Russia, just to give you a sense of the magnitude of it. But the problem is that over exactly the same period of time, economic growth has caused energy demand to increase by a staggering 48 billion megawatt hours. So in other words, all the clean energy that we have rolled out covers only a small fraction of new demand. That's why emissions keep rising. It's like we are shoveling sand into a hole that just keeps getting bigger. And in the end, the problem is going to cripple us. If we continue growing the global economy at existing rate, it will nearly triple in size by the middle of the century. So by the year in which we have set the goal of reaching net zero emissions at the global level, the energy system is going to be 3 times the size that it's today. That means, as a consequence, 3 times more production and consumption than we are already doing, which will, of course, require also 3 times more materials and energy. So it's difficult enough to decarbonize the existing global economy, virtually impossible, in my opinion, to do it 3 times over. But of course, the green growth discourse answers to all these concerns with one just magic word, which is decoupling. Decoupling, the strategy of decoupling touts efficiency as a recipe for more goods and services to be produced at a lower environmental cost. Now, this is a thorny issue, the one of decoupling, and I admit that, let's say, there is no a priori reason why efficiency cannot increase faster than scale, or even as fast as necessary to reduce impact to sustainable level. Furthermore, insofar as GDP remains our measure, and GDP measures what people are willing to pay for things, as opposed to the amount of energy and resource that people actually consume, there is, let's say, no theoretical reason why the economy cannot grow using progressively less energy and resources while GDP keeps on growing. Why? Well, because people preferences may shift to goods and services with ever lower energy and material requirements. So in the light of these two caveats, one may conclude that decoupling should theoretically be possible. And in fact, this is precisely the reason why advocates of green growth are not deterred by claims that, well, decoupling has not happened yet and does not seem likely to happen in the future. They attribute all this to lack of effort. So with the right policies, we could get there. However, in order to navigate this debate, which is so crucial, we needed to make a distinction between relative and absolute decoupling. Relative decoupling refers to a decline in the ecological intensity per unit of economic output. So the use of energy and raw materials does not decline in absolute terms. Environmental impacts may still increase, but they do so at a slower pace than growth in GDP. And so this goal of relative decoupling is attainable in capitalist systems, is actually the engine of growth, right? So increasing efficiency in production allows you to reduce resource inputs that represent a cost for producers, so you increase your surplus value. On the contrary, absolute decoupling is when ecological resource declines in absolute terms over time. So not just in relationship to GDP, but in absolute terms. And these latter situations of absolute decoupling is essential if economic activity is to remain within ecological limits. And the validity of the green growth discourse relies on the assumption of an absolute, permanent, global, large and fast enough decoupling of GDP from all critical environmental pressures. But the problem with all this is that there is no empirical evidence for such decoupling having ever happened, be it for materials, energy, water, land, biodiversity, greenhouse gas emissions. Decoupling that has been observed in the scientific literature is either only relatively or observed only temporarily or only locally. And the very few instances in which absolute decoupling has occurred, it's actually for rather short periods of time or concerning only certain sources, only certain resources or environmental impacts, or it happens only in specific locations and with minuscule rates of mitigation. So it is a thing, it has happened, but at a scale that is absolutely not, let's say, sufficient in order to meet our environmental targets and keep the world economy within a safe operating space. So in spite of all this empirical evidence, green growthers still insist that absolute decoupling has not happened because we haven't tried hard enough. And indeed, again, it cannot be proven that absolute decoupling is theoretically impossible, at least not as long as ultimate limits in efficiency and substitution have not been reached. So as a result, I think that in navigating this discourse, our only reliable guide should be the empirical cases of decoupling. And beating on the point that these empirical studies demonstrate that green growth is at best highly unlikely, and that therefore we should embrace a more precautionary approach. Policies should be made on the basis of robust empirical evidence rather than on the basis of speculative theoretical possibilities, particularly given to the severity of the crisis that is at stake. So in a way, it's so hard to demonstrate that absolute decoupling cannot happen because, again, the way in which we measure GDP. And so I think we should shift in a way the debate away from a purely, let's say, away from purely economicistic terms and more towards, let's say, an ethical discussion about what is at stake and whether we are actually willing to risk the stability of the biosphere in order to chase these, let's say, neoclassical illusions. And absolute decoupling of GDP from emissions is therefore highly unlikely to happen, as I was saying, and it becomes even harder, of course, against a background of continued economic growth. So all the models that successfully project global GDP growth at 2, 3% per year, while maintaining us within the carbon budget, rely heavily on negative emission technologies that are either unproven or dangerous at scale. So again, it's an ethical issue here. And while a lower rate of GDP growth requires a lower rate of reduction of carbon intensity, we have to bear in mind what a lower rate of GDP growth would be, because I don't think it's enough that we just settle for saying, okay, 3% GDP growth year on year is too much to achieve a satisfactory level of decarbonization, so we can bring it down to 2%, let's say. The point is that if you look actually at the number, you realize that the only way in which it's possible to achieve green growth while maintaining the carbon budget, while, let's say, respecting the 2 degrees carbon budget, is by having an aggregate growth at the global level of 0.5% per year. And if we wanted to be ambitious and aim for the 1.5, let's say, target, well, at that point, the only empirically feasible way in which we can do that is by downscaling aggregate economic activity at the global level. And of course, given that many countries in the global south still needed to expand their energy and material use in order to meet certain levels of human development, well, at that point, this means a pretty dramatic contraction of production and consumption in the global north. So all these considerations were, let's say, revolving around the desirability of having growth in a Green New Deal discourse. But the question is, are actually the policies that are proposed for the Green New Deal actually are going to be likely to bring about growth? Well, I seriously doubt that. And this is because social and ecological restoration projects entail more labor-intensive activities than other sectors of the economy. And renewable energy sources have lower profit margins and also lower, let's say, energy rates of return on investment. So basically shifting financial resources from high productivity and high profit sectors to low productivity ones is not a recipe for growth. So an economy of low productivity, low profits, and low energy returns is also an economy that is very unlikely to grow. But that is fine, since our priority right now should not be to grow the economy, but rather to decarbonize the global economy. So the Green New Deal should not be predicated on, let's say, on growth. And also in itself, if we were to adopt all these radical proposals, well, this is even more unlikely to generate growth. So I think we would be in a double bind if we try to pursue a radical Green New Deal while aiming for growth. This being said, some critics may argue that growth is the only way to mobilize the financial resources necessary for the energy transition. And the only way also to get, let's say, the technological innovation that we need in order to make our economies more efficient. But let's bear in mind that it doesn't make sense to grow the GDP and just blindly hope that it will end up basically being invested in solar panel factories. On the contrary, what we need is the government policy to guide and direct existing financial resources. And if the objective is to achieve specific kinds of technological innovation, it makes more sense to invest in those directly or incentivize innovation with targeted policy interventions rather than growing the whole economy indiscriminately and pray for a specific outcome. So think about it. Is it reasonable to grow the plastic industry, the timber industry, the advertising industry, just in order to get more efficient solar panels? Does it make more sense to grow only the clean energy sectors rather than grow also the dirty ones, to try hoping that some of that profit will be reinvested in that? Granted, the higher GDP, the easier it may be to increase investments to renewables, easing competition with other public expenditures. And also, private investments are driven by profit and become harder in a context of contraction. However, a way out of this conundrum is, for example, increasing the proportion of a shrinking GDP that can be directed to the Green New Deal. And this can be achieved by government taking, let's say, greater control of the direction of investment. So a greater socialization of investments. Now, the last point I wanted to discuss briefly is, after all these considerations on why growth is going to make achieving our environmental targets all the more difficult, the question we are left is whether, let's say, a stationary or even a contracting economy would be good for the people. And I think that, at least in rich countries, the answer can be positive, since we don't need more growth in order to improve people's lives. We already have enough income. The problem is that it's captured at the very top. If we share what we already have more fairly, we can improve people's lives right now without, let's say, having to plunder the earth for more. Fairness is an antidote to growth. People realize that growth isn't improving lives anymore. And that's why I think there is an increasing consensus around certain growth proposals. Consider just the fact, for example, that in the US, the poverty rate is worse and real wages lower than in the 70s, despite a doubling of GDP per capita. So none of this growth is really reflected in the quality of life of the bottom, let's say, 70–80% of society. And a higher GDP doesn't necessarily entail a better quality of life. Just consider the fact that Europe outperforms the US on every social indicators, despite its GDP per capita being 40% lower. So this means that at least 40% of the GDP that is created in the US is basically to no good. It's not actually gonna improve the lives of the people. And you also have to think that certain countries, such as Costa Rica, are able to achieve, let's say, human development at higher levels than the US with just 1/7 of the GDP per capita. So this means that, again, 6/7 of US GDP is actually to no good to the people. Therefore, and this is the final point I want to make, a post-growth Green New Deal is not about reducing GDP, but rather about avoiding the ecological breakdown. But since most likely this, let's say, a transition towards a more ecological sustainable economy is likely to result in a contraction of the economy, well, we must set up policies that ensure human well-being and equality in a non-growing economy. So I would define the logical steps for a post-growth Green New Deal as follows. To stop climate change, we not only need to clean production, but also to reduce and transform consumption. Therefore, climate policies that are needed to achieve these goals are not currently implemented because of their negative impacts of growth. Therefore, third point, we have to pursue them independently of whether or not they are good for the economy, because we put people before the economy. And this leads to the final point. We have to develop a process of adaptation to the foreseen stagnation, contraction of the economy, which prioritizes ecological sustainability, human well-being, and equality. So reducing energy use not only requires energy efficiency, but also support for low energy lifestyles and legislation against energy intensive equipment and planned obsolescence. And of course, in scaling down aggregate resource use, we should start with rich, high consuming social groups within nations and the rich, high consuming nations at the global level in order to control the economy in a progressive way. And how can we make this happen? Well, there are 5 steps, I think, that are essential for a post-growth Green New Deal that then maybe we can develop more in the Q&A part. First of all, abandon GDP as a measure for progress for all the reasons above. Second, scale down energy use. And this, let's say, entails that governments apply, let's say, a cap on aggregate energy demand. It's not enough that we're trying to increase efficiency because of the rebound effect. We actually need to put a cap on aggregate energy demand. And part of this can be indeed achieved through more energy efficiency products, but a more robust approach is to reduce the material footprint. The reason for this is because most of the energy is used not directly by households, but rather in industrial programs to produce goods and services. So, for example, a way we could achieve this is by legislating for longer-lasting products. So, banning planned obsolescence, introducing a right to repair, mandatory recyclability, mandatory long-term warrants for products, and shift the private provisioning to public provisioning, as I was discussing earlier on about decommodification. So, public transportation instead of private cars, public water instead of bottled water, etc. So this approach to reducing material throughput has the added benefit of also releasing pressure on ecosystems. So not just reducing carbon emissions, but also releasing pressure on, for example, biodiversity loss or land use. Third key proposal, shorten the working week and distribute available work more fairly and equally to ensure full employment. In fact, not only does a shorter working week have all sorts of positive ecological and social benefits, but it also relieves pressure for growth. In fact, in the existing economy, as labor productivity improves, people get laid off, and we have to generate more growth in order to create new jobs and mop up unemployment. Shortening the working week instead allows us to create jobs without the need for growth. And it also ensures that if aggregate economic activity slows down, which again, it's all the more likely with these policies, then workers laid off from dying, let's say, dirty industrial sector can get jobs in cleaner ones, also through a green job guarantee, as I was discussing before. Fourth proposal, distribute national income more fairly. Use the proceeds of taxes on wealth and income and of course also on resource and energy use to, first of all, help fund a rapid rollout of renewable energy infrastructure, B, contribute to a universal basic income / universal basic services, and C, invest in public goods. The fifth and last policy proposal, which I think is key, is to expand the universal social goods and reinstate commons to ensure that people can access the resources they need in order to live well without high levels of income. This, therefore, means generous, high-quality public healthcare and education, rent controls, affordable public housing and transportation, access to public parks and recreational facilities, you name it. The list is very long of what we can decommodify to make, let's say, to bring about a system of private sufficiency and public luxury for all, just to use a slogan. To conclude and trying to sum up a bit what I think the intersection between the Green New Deal political discourse and the post-growth economic proposals can be, is that while all these, let's say, proposals that I've just discussed may seem a political non-starter, I think that what is politically realistic today may have very little to do with what is politically realistic after another few summers of record-breaking heat waves, uncontrollable forest fires, droughts, the spreading of the pandemic, etc. In the meantime, while there is a shift in political consensus, climate justice activists should adopt a stance of critical support, embracing, let's say, the political opening afforded by the Green New Deal, while at the same time contesting some of its specific elements, hence expanding, let's say, the political horizon in order to create opportunities for post-growth ideas, let's say, to seep into this political discourse. And to do this, we need, let's say, creative experimentation with policies and institutions, but of course also extra parliamentary disruptive actions from below. For example, taking inspiration from Extinction Rebellion and global youth climate strikes. So social movements must target political elites and make them feel threatened, let's say, enough to exercise the state's relatively autonomy to capital's short-term prerogatives. The Green New Deal, at least the one I was discussing with you now, it's the result of decades of environmental struggles. And I don't think we should take, a dogmatic position in rejecting it simply because it's not ambitious enough, and still so much more there is to do in order to radicalize into the points that I was trying to sketch out above. So let's say that I think that the progressive climate justice activists, rather than rejecting the Green New Deal for not being ambitious enough, should try to hijack it towards more progressive and radical directions. And the battles that we will engage in order to achieve these goals have the potential to unleash desire and transform identities and radicalizing them. So through this process, we will learn, screw up, and learn again. It's not going to be a straightforward progress. But the Green New Deal does not offer a prepackaged solution, but rather it's a terrain of political struggles. It opens up opportunities, but it's constantly a contested terrain. And so what I say to all climate justice activists is, let's seize it. I will leave it at that, and I'll be happy to discuss more in the Q&A. Thank you.